the sketching for the landscape, starting with the horizon line, which is above the center of the page. The horizon line is where the eyes meet the ground. That cuts the background and the foreground. So looking at the bigger shapes in the picture, the mountains, it's a white building, just a little bit of white in the background, the mountains that are far away, some trees in the background, the shapes. And coming to the boards, getting the shape first instead of looking at the details. There is the first board in the picture, bigger shape. Next, getting the other board, the second board. And the third one, getting the top of the board, the shade. Keep the drawing a little bit light. You don't want too many of these pencil lines. Making these lines a little bit straight. So have your bigger shapes before you go to the smaller ones. This is the overall bigger shape. Now getting on to some of the shapes inside the board. Those are the shadows. Getting parallel to these lines. Parallel. So the shadow. Checking for the angles of these lines is really important. So there's one more small board which is here, but I move the small board onto this side for balance. So getting the arch, drawing this line, drawing one more line, joining these two lines, and there's the board in the back, which is going to be light, and it has some, this is the ore, and some shapes of people sitting in the board. Just a detailed drawing, just the suggestion of the shapes. So this is the seating area. Draw two parallel lines, connect them together. Same thing following on this board. Just getting this a little bit darker. Two parallel lines. Starting with the painting, I use the 1.5 big brush to wet the whole sheet of paper. So this is going to be wet in wet wash, so you don't want any dry spots. Keep moving back and forth, so you saturate the paper with the moisture, so it remains wet for a while when you drop in the colors, so it's easy to blend the colors on the paper. So this is a 1.5 inch flat brush. So I have masking tape around, so just take off all the extra moisture around. So now switching to the round brush. A light wash of yellow ochre. It's a pale wash starting from the sky. just going on to the water. So you want the sunlight hitting onto the water and getting some of the color onto the boat, still on the yellow ochre, getting onto the reflections under the boat and getting a little bit stronger onto the mountains, leaving this white. So I just pick up a mixture of Cobalt Blue and Ultramarine Blue, and I just drop some blue for the sky, very light, not too dark, and soften, leaving some shapes for the clouds. So I use my paper towel and pick up some lights and go a little bit more darker, popping out some of the cloud shapes. A little bit more ultramarine blue. You can use your paper towel to lift up the clouds and darken these shapes around the clouds. Not much color onto the sky. And the farther the objects, they're lighter in value. So I use blue for the background mountains. That's ultramarine blue. The paper is still wet, and add a tiny bit of red. That's Indian red, and soften it up as I go down, and more of the yellow ochre mixed with the blue. This is more yellow ochre wherever the light is hitting on the mountains. Just brushing it up with the yellow ochre. Very light blue onto this area. And if I see some bleeding into the water area, I just use my paper towel to lighten it up. Mixing some Viridian green into ultramarine blue with a little bit yellow ochre. I just drop in some of the color onto the tip of these mountains. That's Viridian green, ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. So rather than blending the colors on the palette, we're going to blend the colors on the paper. The farther objects are always lighter than the foreground trees. See some buildings in the back, so leaving some white areas. Adding a touch of yellow, Aureolin Yellow for the lights, not too bright. Just fade it down. So wherever I see the light, I add a little bit of the yellow into the yellow ochre. A stronger value of the ultramarine blue, the Viridian green and the yellow ochre. So I'm using the round brush. And the paper is still wet, working wet on wet. So dropping in some colors, leaving some areas lighter. So these also just the trees in the background. And we can pick up some of the color that is bleeding into the water because the paper is wet. And ultramarine blue getting more stronger onto the mountains in the back. It's too strong, so just lighten it up a little bit more, leaving some lights hitting in some area. So, and if I see it's too dark, I just use my paper towel to lift. So it gives a misty appearance to the mountains. I switch to the round quill brush, switching to the spin synthetic brush that has a good point. Viridian green, ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. It's getting the suggesting the shape of these mountains here, more color, and suggesting some of the trees. Still working wet on wet, getting some light green. I see a lot of light here, so just pick up some of the with a paper towel, lighten it up and add more of the lighter green, more yellow, and suggesting more light and a little bit light on this part. The background mountain, very light. and suggesting the tip of this mountain, getting more yellow ochre underneath. It's too dark. And getting some of the ultramarine blue for the dark areas, the trees in the background. That's ultramarine blue. Add a little bit of burnt sienna. It's darker in some places. It's ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. So when you're doing this, the paint is not too thin, it's a little bit thicker, so it doesn't flood too much, but it disperses into the wet paper a little bit, suggesting all those trees in the background. Burnt sienna, much thicker paint, suggesting some trees. Shaping some of those mountains. So maintaining this shape white. A thicker value of the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna, making some shapes. So when the paper is still wet, I just make the shapes of some trees in the background. The paper is getting damp, so while it's still wet, I keep working, adding some of the darker trees. And if you feel it's dry, so you want to wait until it's dry and wet the paper again and do it. So suggesting the shapes of the mountains in the background, adding more yellow onto the lighter areas, trying not to lose the lights. That's Aureolin Yellow. And just making this part a little darker, just some more of the darks. Good dark mixture of the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna. Just getting some tree shapes there and just leaving the paper to dry. Don't want to overwork on this painting. So I see the darks here and I see some of the darks in this part around this building. So using a smaller brush and having some shapes, white shapes. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna again, and showing some buildings or houses in the back. Just a couple of shapes popping out there. Just a little bit more dark on the mountains in the back. Still a little bit misty. So let the paper dry completely. We'll come back with the foreground. Getting more color on the canopy of the boat, Cobalt Blue. So once this is dry, we'll come back to the shadows on the canopy. Since this boat is in the background, You don't want it too strong, just much lighter. The base of the boat. Fixing the sky a little bit, making some areas a little bit more stronger, popping out the white clouds. That's Ultramarine Blue, softening the edges. Very light wash of the yellow ochre for the light. Now coming to the boats, having more yellow ochre, leaving some lights, adding burnt sienna. So this is the shadow area, it's much darker. So there's light here, there's light here. Wherever the light is, I soften it up, making the yellow ochre much lighter, or you can even just pick it up with a paper towel. Painting around the oar, and this side, the lighter side, more water, keeping it lighter value.